Sometimes in sport, you just need a little bit of luck. Sometimes raw speed or raw talent just isn't enough. And in Formula 1 especially, there can be times where the stars don't seem to align, but just move further and further and further apart. Those what-if moments, like what if it started raining just 5 minutes later, or not rained at all in the closing stages of the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, or if Luca Badoa's gearbox had held up for a little longer at the 1999 European Grand Prix, or if Mansell's tyre had held on for a little longer at the 1986 Australian Grand Prix. The list goes on and on and on, and there's probably a few more that could be mentioned there. And no unluckiest list is ever complete without mentioning Chris Amon. The talented Kiwi never seemed to have it go his way, and it was often joked that Amon was so unlucky that if he quit racing and became an undertaker, people would miraculously stop dying. His 1968 season is considered his unluckiest, although there are a lot to choose from, but that season tends to stick out. He'd been on pole at Jarama and led, but the car broke down. The same thing happened at Mont Tremblant, and then he dominated qualifying at Spa and was battling for the lead, but, as you guessed, his car broke down. He finished 10th that year, but was third on the laps led statistics, and he'd been faster than his teammate Jackie Ickx, who ended up finishing the season with 3 times the amount of points. And although it can be an absolute pigsty at times, some of the stuff you come across on Reddit can be quite useful. Because among the people chatting rubbish on there will also be stat hounds and anoraks who will come out with some useful information. The first ever episode of this series was adapted from a Reddit post, as it so happens, because it was just, well, that interesting. And on there, somebody has listed the unluckiest seasons, including Dan Gurney's 1964, Ronnie Peterson in 1973, John Watson in 77, and the more recent seasons include Verstappen's 2017, Raikkonen's 2005, Leclerc's 2022, and probably the saddest one I ever watched, Mika Hakkinen in 2001. And while on the subject of 2001, not only had you got Mika Hakkinen in a McLaren that was about as fragile as Colin Chapman's finest Lotuses, there was another driver on the grid who ended the season lucky to be alive. 2001 was most definitely a year, not just geopolitically but also because of how the motorsport year began, with Dale Earnhardt's death at that year's Daytona 500. An accident that was exactly that, an accident. But it triggered a raft of safety upgrades in the sport, and since then NASCAR has not had a single fatal. I've covered all that in full before, so I won't go into the details of it to keep things more in line with the main bulk of this particular story. But the 2001 motorsport season did end with Richard Burns winning the WRC title, so while it started off in a sad fashion, it did end on a high. But in Formula 1, the season was looking set to be another battle between McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari had won in 2000 and 2001, taking the drivers and constructors doubles, and this in turn left Schumacher level with Prost on 4 titles, and he was now only behind Fangio, who was still the record holder, with 5. I don't think anybody expected the Michael to win another 3 and push the records even further, but he did. And as a younger F1 fan, that was quite annoying, admittedly, but as time goes on, you come to respect it a bit more as you learn more about the sport. And it was also the time where the privateers' time, or the garagistas' time in Formula 1, was limited. Over the next 2 or 3 years, the manufacturers would come to dominate the sport and push the budgets through the roof. And if a team couldn't connect with a big manufacturer in some way, either as a customer team or through being bought by one, they were going to struggle. Sauber stayed alive through doing with Ferrari what Haas does with Ferrari today. Williams had signed on with BMW and Honda had teamed up with BAR. Although that wasn't necessarily a privateer, because BAR wasn't just sponsored by a tobacco company, it was a tobacco company. But the days of Arrows, Prost and Minardi were looking darker and darker, and Jordan was going to fall into that group soon enough. Especially since Arrows and Jordan would be taken to court for various things either over the course of 2001 and into 2002, or even for stuff that had happened before 2001 and 2002. But the third privateer that was really in trouble through 2001 was Prost. Now, I've covered the Prost team's struggles in previous videos, so again I'm not going to go into the same amount of detail, but by the time the 2001 season started, they really were in trouble. The 2000 season was abysmal, and it saw Peugeot leave Prost high and dry, and Gaulois and the other sponsors leaving in droves. So this left Prost with a budget that rivaled the late 80s Italian have-a-go heroes, and designer Alan Jenkins was fired after the Monaco Grand Prix of 2000. In 2001, Prost had Acer-branded Ferrari engines that were costing Alan an absolute fortune to use, and they had Jean Alesi in the squad carried over from the previous year. In the other car was an Argentine called Gaston Mazzacane, who was presumably signed because, well, Prost needed the money. And I didn't know this until now, but Prost was testing Oriol Sevilla for that seat, but they gave it to Gaston instead. Again, probably because of wallet size, and Prost desperately needed the cash. Mazzacane had backing from a TV network called PSN, which I don't think lasted particularly long. What also didn't last long was Mazzacane's time with the Prost team. He was sacked just 4 races into the 2001 season, as Alan had triggered a performance clause in his contract. At Melbourne, his engine and brakes failed on the first lap, and at Malaysia, he was 12th on a lap behind a lazy. In Brazil, his clutch went, and at Imola, which was the San Marino Grand Prix at the time, his engine went. But at least Prost had a replacement lined up. Luciano Burti had just joined Formula 1 and was driving for the Jaguar team, a team I've covered in full before under the tagline of "Did Ford Even Care?" And yes, the Stewart family got paid big time for the purchase of the team, but Ford didn't want to seem to put in the time and effort because, well, Jaguar was just a subsidiary brand, and they didn't want to put in the effort because it didn't have the massive blue oval on the engine cover. Either way, Jaguar had been poodling away in mid-table mediocrity, and as is the case for this time period, finding pictures of the drivers in question is going to be tricky. So if you see another Jaguar driver or a picture that's not that year's Jaguar, I'm just doing these for illustration purposes only. You might see a Jag, but it might not be the Jag. Either way, Burti had come in after having an okay junior career. He'd finished runner-up to Mark Hines in British Formula 3 in 1999 while driving for, ironically, Paul Stewart Racing. But as can happen, it was a driver finishing lower down who would be the superstar. Because finishing third that year in 99? Jenson Button, who went to Williams for 2000, while Burti ended up as Jaguar's test driver for 2000. At Jackie Stewart's insistence, I might add. Burti tested for Jag all through 2000, but was given a race seat for the Austrian Grand Prix that year, because Eddie Irvine was ill and was being paid megabucks by Ford to sit at home and get better. And Eddie Irvine pulled off what is possibly the best piece of daylight robbery seen in motorsport, in terms of his wages that is. But Burti's inexperience in a race seat showed, finishing 11th in the race in no man's land, because he was 2 laps down. He was 1 lap behind Wurtz's Benetton, who was in the position ahead, and 1 lap ahead of Mazzacane's Minardi, that was in 12th, and last. His first full season with Jaguar, well, at least what he thought would be a full season, did start okay. At the first race in Australia, he'd beaten Eddie Irvine, finishing 8th where Irvine was 11th, and then finished 10th at Malaysia while Irvine retired with a water leak. He couldn't finish at Brazil because his engine had blown up, and then after Imola, he was let go. But he'd finished 11th again, while Irvine hadn't finished the Grand Prix at all. But at that Australian Grand Prix, it was going to be a taste of how his 2001 season was going to go. On the exit of Turn 5 in practice, Burti was involved in an accident where it could have gone worse than it did. As he was in the corner, his left rear suspension failed and he spun, with the car then partially lifting up as the tyres dug into the soft grass. Luckily, the car only got lifted up on the right-hand side and didn't fully go over, but it spun twice while skipping over the grass and then crunched into the wall. A concrete wall. The thing is, Burti had hit that wall mere metres after the tyre barrier ended, trashing his car and shaking him about. But that race weekend was going to get worse. As you might recall, this is the Grand Prix where Graham Everidge, a volunteer marshal, was killed after a tyre hit him following a collision between Ralf Schumacher and Jacques Villeneuve. So Burti had endured a baptism of fire, although not literally in the case of Giovanni Lavaggi at the German Grand Prix of 1996, when he sat in his Minardi that was on fire. And I don't think he knew that it was on fire. But Burti's race performances were okay. I mean, they weren't great, but they were okay. Okay considering it was his first full-time ride in Formula 1. But his departure from Jaguar came as somewhat of a surprise. Jaguar had originally said that Burti would not be sacked at any point, but Jaguar signing Pedro de la Rosa as a test driver hadn't done much for confidence in the young Brazilian. The tension was calmed by Jaguar saying that Pedro was coming in for 2002, and no earlier. But Burti was gone from the team that would later become Red Bull, but with Mazzacane booted from Prost it meant that Burti had somewhere to go at least. And I've been digging through forum posts from the time and people thought that Mazzacane getting kicked was a stupid idea because of the money that Gaston was bringing. Sponsors weren't exactly forming a long queue to join the French team, so Alain would have to take whatever he could get. But it is what it is. And actually thinking about it, the Diniz family had bought in, so maybe it was them calling the shots. But that said, Burti, like Mazzacane, is South American, so I don't think PSN cared either way whether they got a Brazilian or Argentinian, just as long as they had a South American, because I think that PSN broadcasted in Brazil. It's just that the Well, the Wikipedia page is all in Spanish. But it does actually say here that they had PSN, PSN Premium, and PSN Brazil. So PSN was just like the main feed that was broadcast to all of Latin America. PSN Premium, which was Chile only, was exactly the same thing, just with more football. And then you had PSN Brazil. Now, I can only apologise for what I'm about to do. So it says PSN Brazil, señal exclusiva para Brazil, donde toda la programación, is that how you say it? Era idéntica a la señal latinoamericana, pero en idioma portugués. Which means an exclusive broadcast just for Brazil, where all the programming was identical to the main Latin American broadcast, just in Portuguese. I've still got it. But Burti's time at Prost was going to be... tough is an understatement. Because in just his third race weekend with the team, he almost ended up on a hospital bed. During practice for the Monaco Grand Prix, he left the pits, which were slightly different in this time because you left the pits directly onto the start-finish straight instead of going through turn 1, and as he headed into Saint-Devote, the brakes failed. He went straight ahead at Saint-Devote, and it's a good thing he wasn't at hot lap speed because it would have been much worse than it actually was. In the panic of trying to get the brakes to work, he actually hit the gas and sped up a bit, having to crash himself into a tyre wall to avoid hitting recovery vehicles that were parked beyond the corner. The FIA probably changed the protocols after this because it was not abundantly clear that a car could get that far up there, and it would have been a huge problem if they had a crash like the one between Maldonado and Verstappen in 2015, was it? But either way, Burti had already been involved in 2 big crashes, and he wasn't even 7 races into the season. But the thing is, despite Prost's problems, Burti was competitive. Competitive for what the car was going to give him, at least. Alesi had been 10th in Spain and Austria, while Burti was 11th in both of those races. He retired from Monaco but got his best result with Prost when he scored an 8th at Canada, but then things fell off. He was 12th at the Nürburgring, although there was a top 10 at Manicourt, but then he had 3 non-finishes in a row, with one of them pretty severe. At the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, the first start had to be aborted when Schumacher struggled to get off the line and was swamped by everybody around him. The gearbox wasn't working properly and the Ferrari was really struggling to move, and the start of the German Grand Prix in that era was usually a mad one because of the slipstreaming that used to go on at the start of that race. Hockenheim, for the last time ever in 2001, was essentially an oval with 3 chicanes and a twiddly bit at the end, so the fans could actually see the cars for more than a split second. Burti, unsighted, mullered the back of the Ferrari and got air that would make Mark Webber wince. In turn, as he came down, he landed on top of Enrique Bernaldi's arrows, and it was just a huge accident. Now, at this point, I would insert a picture of the accident because you can buy one, but, well, 350 quid? No, I'm not doing it. I'm not paying 350 quid. I'll stick to Alamy, thanks. Thankfully, nobody was injured and all 3 cars took the restart, but Burti spun off on lap 23 of the race and retired. But Prost had a total chassis that they really did not need. But it was nobody's fault. Schumacher does move to the right a little, but he was just trying to get out of people's way. It was just one of those things and Burti was just unsighted. But after Melbourne, Monaco and now Hockenheim, how could it get any worse? His engine blew at Silverstone, which resulted in another retirement, but at the Belgian Grand Prix, he was incredibly unlucky, but at the same time, very, very, very lucky. On lap 5 of the Grand Prix, Burti was battling with Eddie Irvine, his former teammate, as they came out of Stavelot and made the climb up the hill back towards the bus stop, and then to complete the lap. Now, the race was already held under a degree of added tension, because at the start, Frentzen in the Jordan and Marquez in the Minardi had stalled their cars before the formation lap, meaning that they had to abandon the start and chalk a lap off the tally. So the race distance was now 43 laps and not #blessed. When they did get a formation lap done, Montoya stalled his car and also had to start from the back of the grid. But as mentioned, on lap 5, Irvine and Burti were battling. Irvine had just been knocked down to 15th as Montoya had overtaken him, and Burti had stuck his nose up the inside of Irvine in a bid to get at the inside for Blanchimont. But Irvine, caught off guard, stuck to the racing line, moving across in front of the Prost. Burti was sent onto the grass and needed to back out, and as the 2 cars made contact, the front wing of the Prost was taken off, and with no front end downforce, the car was not going to turn in. Because the car was skipping across the grass and the gravel on the exit of Blanchimont, it meant that for the second time this season, Burti was heading towards a wall with no brakes. But this wasn't Monaco, this was Spa, and he was travelling at racing speeds instead of just out of the pit lane speeds. He left the track at 180 miles an hour, but had managed to somehow slow it down to 150 when he hit the tyre wall. The thing about Blanchimont is that it didn't have much runoff then, and it still doesn't even now. And I hope you can understand now that crashes like this are why we have tarmac runoff these days. But either way, if you have an accident at Blanchimont, it's going to be a big one. But big accidents at that corner are rare, somewhat thankfully. All the big ones at Spa seem to happen at Eau Rouge and Raidillon for some reason. But Burti had slammed into the tyre wall fast and hard, while Irvine had crashed a bit further along and was able to get out of his car under his own steam. Now, you know how racing helmets cover your entire head and face, and some of us need bigger helmets than others? Well, what if I was to tell you that the impact with the wall was so severe that all this area got removed, snapped clean off, however you want to describe it. Either way, there was just a hole here. What's also incredible, and this is the lucky part of things, is that Burti had gone into a tyre wall that was about 4 tyres deep. If he'd crashed only 10-15 metres along, he'd have ended up where Irvine did, and the tyre wall there was only 2 tyres deep. At those speeds and in that time period, if he'd gone in head first at that speed into the lesser amount of tyres, he would have probably been dead. There was no hands device at this point, and if he'd crashed a mid-90s car there, he most certainly would have been dead. And the mid-90s at this point was 6 years ago. He had facial bruising and a major concussion, but he was alive, and that was the important bit. But his career, in Formula 1 at least, was effectively over. 111G he sustained in the impact, and Irvine got out of his car and assisted with the rescue. Sid Watkins arrived not long after the race was red flagged to supervise the extraction, and Burti was taken to the medical centre at the circuit, conscious and aware of where he was. But several changes had been made for the 2001 season which improved the survival odds. The safety cell and the cockpit area had been opened up more and done so to reduce the risk of injuries to the driver's legs, and the overall crash tests had been increased in terms of the speeds at which they were conducted. So at the time of the crash, Burti was in the safest Formula 1 cars ever. Burti was replaced by Czech rookie Thomas Enge for the rest of the season. But with Prost going bust and no other seats available for 2002, he signed on for a test driver role with Ferrari, a role which he had until 2004. Burti came into Formula 1 with a decently funded team, only to be kicked aside for seemingly no reason. He then ended up at an underfunded and down on its luck Prost team that was being shafted left, right and centre, and before the midpoint of the season, he'd been involved in 2 pretty scary accidents. Then, only a few races later, he's unsighted at the start of the German Grand Prix and lands on another car, upside down, potentially severely injuring him and the driver of the Arrows he landed on, and then he destroys another chassis at Belgium. Now, the only one of these crashes he can be considered any modicum of fault for is Spa, but the other 3? He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he'd been considered to be in the right place at the right time because he'd replaced Johnny Herbert at Jaguar, and Johnny retired at the end of the 2000 season, which left the seat open for Luciano. His career was over after just 13 races, 14 if you count the Austrian Grand Prix of 2000. But in a world of Chris Amons and whoever you think is the most unlucky driver since 2014, Luciano Burti is a driver who is definitely up there in terms of unluckiness. Most people who are involved in 4 shunts in 1 year are memed. The guy was involved in 4 shunts and 3 of those were through no fault of his own. They were down to just things going wrong or, well, a car that might have been borderline dangerous. But I'd like to know what you think down in the comment section. So then, a look at the very short and very unlucky career of Brazil's Luciano Burti. If this has given you some insight into what went so wrong for him or what happened that day at Spa, then do like the video so I know that you've learned something, or otherwise, well, like the video. And if you want to take our relationship to the next level, you can subscribe if you haven't already and also get that bell on so you'll always be notified of any future videos, if those notifications go out, because I think YouTube's playing up again. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine folk over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon down in the description, as well as links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to do a one and done donation, and there's memberships there too for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all soon for another video. So until then, goodbye.